This video is going to meander a bit. I'm going to try to cover everything important, but I'm also going to explain how I got to my current understanding of scales. The description shows the start time of each section if you want to skip around. The first section covers definitions and explanations of why I have chosen to use them. The second section is a comparison of Western scales to international scales, which is what started me down this path. The third section is an analysis of notes and scales in general. The fourth section is a description of all possible 7-note scales in a 12-tone tuning system. And the fifth section is a discussion of several pieces I have composed using some of these scales. First, I need to define what I mean when I say scale. This discussion is limited to 12-tone tunings and 7-note scales, but it could be applied to any tuning and/or number of notes. Justin Peckett has written about the dozenal standard, which is every possible pentatonic scale in the 12-tone tuning system. On his YouTube channel, he has improvised a piece for every one of them. I am using 7 notes because that generally allows for several chords to be created, and I like chord progressions. Scale patterns are defined as a sequence of steps between the notes of the scale. The primary 7-note scales in Western music use only half steps and whole steps. A C major scale uses all of the white keys on a piano. So does an A natural minor scale. Therefore, these scales are using the same pattern. In a given scale, the first note that is played is called the root, and starting on different notes of the same scale pattern is defined as playing the modes of the scale. For the purposes of this discussion, modes will be ignored and only the scale pattern will be considered. That said, the spoiler alert counts modes. There are only 62 non-standard scale patterns. But that should be enough to keep composers busy for quite a while. The way that scale patterns are identified is by figuring out how many of each of the 7 steps it takes to total 12 steps. So, with only half steps and whole steps, you have 5 whole steps, which is 10, 2 half steps, which is 2. 10 plus 2 equals 12. Next, determine how many unique patterns are created using exactly 2 half steps and 5 whole steps. This will be discussed in the technical details section. The reason I started down this path was because I had the opportunity to play music with a woman who had trained to sing Indian Carnatic music. It took a while, but I was able to play Western chords while she sang Carnatic songs. Unfortunately, the only recording I have of this is from an open mic we participated in, and the audience noise just makes the music unlistenable. Both Hindustani and Carnatic scales use 12 tones, but they allow for minor and major thirds in their patterns, which produces many scales. The first and fifth notes are fixed at a perfect fifth. The second, third, and fourth notes are set to every possible combination that fits between the first and the fifth. This produces 12 chakras. The sixth and seventh are set to every possible combination fitting between the fifth and the octave, which produces 6 variations for each chakra. Thus, there are 72 scales defined in this genre. Mid-Eastern scales also use 12 tones, but with some modification. This genre includes East Europe, Greece, Turkey, Persia, the Arab countries, and much of North Africa. There are noticeable differences between the regions in the use of melody, rhythm, and instruments. Far Eastern music uses 12 tones, but the scales are 5-note pentatonic scales. For all of them, the main points to consider are they are melodic as opposed to harmonic. This means that not only is the emphasis on melodies, there are essentially no chords. There may occasionally be two notes played, such as when a singer is improvising and a stringed instrument is playing the melody. There are also sometimes drones, where bass notes on string instruments are strummed with no fingering. Some of them incorporate microtones between the 12 tones. These are explicitly defined as half or even a quarter of the way between two notes of a half step. And the rhythms can be significantly different from Western music. The theory behind these genres is beyond the scope of this discussion, but I heartily recommend that every musician learn more about them. I have found that understanding the theory helps me appreciate the music more. Western music is called harmonic because it uses chords. This is not just a guitar being strummed to accompany a singer, but also choirs, orchestras, bands, and even children's songs sung in a round. This section covers how 12-tone tuning came about and how it has been used and modified. The simplest explanation is string harmonics. This was discovered in Greece by Plato. He learned that strings vibrate at multiple frequencies, and he was able to measure the differences between the frequencies and found that they were integer multiples of each other. The first harmonic is 2 times the frequency of the root note and defines the octave. The second harmonic is 3 times the frequency of the root and defines the fifth. The third harmonic is 4 times the frequency of the root note and defines the second octave. Then the fourth, fifth, and sixth harmonics further divide the scale into minor third, perfect fifth, and minor seventh, respectively. In the higher octaves, the minor second, major third, perfect fourth, sharp fourth, perfect fifth, neutral sixth, and major seventh are found. Some cultures use even smaller steps called microtones, but most world music is based on 12 tones. Human vocal cords are essentially strings, which means that singing produces these harmonics. It therefore makes sense that 12 tones are so common. Most musicians are aware of harmonics, but the people who make instruments should understand them thoroughly. For example, hammered strings, such as pianos and dulcimers, produce harmonics that are 1 over the multiplier, the volume of the previous one, while plucked strings, such as guitar and harp, produce harmonics that are 1 over the multiplier squared, the volume of the previous one. And that's just the beginning. The body of the instrument plays a major role, and there are other sounds, such as various hammering or plucking techniques, that make each instrument unique. For more on this, see my video analyzing 15 EDO. Section 3 covers instruments and includes a discussion of harmonics. Just intonation uses harmonics to define scale notes. Notice that in the 5th octave there is both a D sharp and an E flat, as well as an F sharp and a G flat. There are various methods to resolve this, but in just intonation, a C major scale sounds different from a D major scale, and a C minor chord does not sound quite the same as an F minor chord. However, this is the basis for 12-tone tuning. It produces an underlying foundation for creating consistent patterns in songs. In other words, melodies. Equal temperament was developed for the use of harmonic music. It adjusts the 12 notes so that all half steps sound almost the same, and chords sound consistent when played in different octaves or in frequent succession. But why does Western music limit itself to just a few scales? I don't know. There are some very strict rules that are followed to compose Western music. I am not going to cover those because there are dozens of YouTube videos that already do it. But this is not an attempt to break those rules, simply add to them. I hope to convince you that this is a worthwhile effort. And 12-tone music, which defines how to use scales with all 12 tones, was developed for the same reason, which I believe gives legitimacy to my approach. This section covers all possible scale patterns using 7 notes. First, the patterns using only a half step and a whole step. These have 5 whole steps and 2 half steps. The half steps separate the whole steps into groups, and only 3 unique groups exist. 2 of these account for 3 of the Western scales: major, natural minor, and melodic minor. The diatonic chords of these scales are mostly major and minor triads. This provides chord progressions that are straightforward to define. The third pattern is essentially a whole tone scale, with 2 half steps that equal a whole step. There are only 2 chords that are not augmented, thanks to the half steps. One is major, the other is minor. In this example, they are the E major and the B minor. The next patterns use 3 half steps, 3 whole steps, and 1 minor third. There are 20 of these patterns. The half steps and whole steps create 6 patterns, and the minor third then mixes with them to create a total of 20 patterns. The only Western scales that use any of these patterns are the harmonic minor and major, which have a minor third between the 6th and the 7th notes. However, in classical Western music, the harmonic minor is only used when the melody is going up in pitch to allow for a half-step resolution to the octave. When going down in pitch, it reverts to the natural minor. I had not even heard of the harmonic major until recently, so I don't know of any classical music that uses it. Many of the scales in this group sound noticeably different from standard Western scales. And many of the diatonic chords of these scale patterns are not major or minor triads. However, those triads can sometimes be found using the 2nd or 4th note from the root, followed by the 6th note. There are also many scale patterns with augmented or diminished chords instead of major or minor chords, and the mixture of these additional chords can make some interesting chord progressions. These patterns use 4 half steps, 1 whole step, and 2 minor thirds. There are 15 of these patterns. A lot of world music uses scale patterns with minor thirds. This is a significant part of the reason that it sounds different from Western music. Again, many of the diatonic chords of these scale patterns are not major or minor triads and are quite dissonant. But chords can be found outside of the diatonic chords. Using chord progressions that these patterns produce can create melodies that sound almost Western. The next pattern uses 4 half steps, 2 whole steps, and 1 major third. This creates 15 patterns. The diatonic chords tend to sound dissonant, and there are even fewer major and minor triads than in the previous patterns. The melodies that can be created sound distinctly different from Western melodies. The next patterns contain 5 half steps, 1 minor third and 1 major third, which creates only 6 patterns. No Western scales or Indian chakras use them. The diatonic chords tend to sound dissonant, and the major and minor triads overlap quite a bit. This requires some rethinking of how to structure music in a harmonic style. Some possibilities are: use more melody without chords. Use 2 notes instead of 3. Set 2 of the notes in a triad to a half or whole step apart. Use triads with notes that are more than a major third apart. Just like the major and natural minor are the same pattern, there are many of the 72 Indian classical chakras that have the same pattern. In fact, they only use 36 of the possible patterns. Finally, there are 7 more scale patterns which I ignore. By using 5 half steps, 1 whole step, and a natural fourth, 6 patterns are created. 1 more pattern is created with 6 half steps and a sharp fourth. The reason I ignore them is that the fourths group the notes in half the octave. The natural fourth allows for the root and the fifth and the minor and/or major third. So only 1 or 2 triad chords with the same root can be played. The sharp fourth pattern has no major or minor chords. It may be possible to create music from this, but I feel that it would sound contrived. In summation, there are a total of 66 unique 7-note scale patterns in a 12-tone tuning. This section goes into several compositions I have written using some of these scales. I will discuss the challenges I faced and the discoveries I made while working with them. Look Closer was the first piece in which I used a Carnatic chakra exclusively, specifically a Brahma chakra. It took me a few tries before I became comfortable with the scale, which has 2 minor thirds. The diatonic chords only have an E minor with 1 inversion. But there are some nice chords outside of the diatonic ones. It starts with a melody that consists of 3 phrases. The first 2 use 1 or 2 notes and end on the C major 7th. The third is twice as long and eventually gets to a C augmented, which then goes to an E minor. Notice how the minor thirds make it sound pensive. Later in the piece, the tempo picks up, but the chord progression still doesn't feel like it's going to resolve. The hard break helps, but there isn't really a Western-style resolution. Shredding my synth is almost all melody. One weekend I split my Roland FA08 into 2 sections with overlapping octaves and came up with a few dozen riffs using a DC chakra. This scale has a single minor third and spreads the whole steps and half steps fairly evenly. The diatonic chords are not very dissonant. And the non-diatonic chords are fairly pleasant. I took the riffs and arranged them in a reasonably sensible order. It starts with a riff that is mostly minor, but with the occasional major phrase. The riffs evolve over the course of the piece, going from rock to weird jingles and back. Eventually, it builds to a climatic finish, using the C minor with a major seventh. This gives it a pleasant feel, even with the rock percussion. This scale pattern was straightforward to use for melodies, and at this point I felt confident that using non-standard scales would be a bit different from using major and minor scales, but not too difficult to work with. For the perfect question, I chose another DC chakra. Again, the scale has a single minor third and spreads the whole steps and half steps fairly evenly. The diatonic chords are mostly minor, but with D and E flat major and a full A diminished. And there are quite a few chords outside of the diatonic group, so I felt like there would be several directions it could go. The beginning is very slow, so I decided to add some words to it. Since I am not a singer, I came up with a speaking part. Then I wanted to tell a story, which in this case was happening all in my head. Finally, at the end, I am interacting with others. So I had a new composition using a non-standard scale, except that it felt very familiar. And then one day I played the scale over 2 octaves and discovered what some of you have already figured out. The DC chakra I was using has the same pattern as the harmonic minor scale. And that was what sent me down the path of finding out exactly what is going on with scales. The C-Sound Generator program I wrote for my exploration of microtonal music has the capability to create lists of scale patterns. So I created the list of all 7-note scales in a 12-tone tuning. And now I define the scales using their pattern. By the way, shredding my synth is using a harmonic major scale, which I had never heard of until recently when a video by Rick Beato from several years ago popped up in my YouTube feed. So it is possible that there are still scales I'm not aware of out there, but I'm pretty sure that of the 66 possible scale patterns, only a few are defined in Western music. The scale pattern used in choices is half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, minor third, half step. This is almost a harmonic minor, except that the steps from the root are reversed, from whole step, half step to half step, whole step. The diatonic chords are a bit unusual, with some major and minor chords, but others that are dissonant. The chords outside the diatonic group are interesting, but don't feel like they belong together. This piece took a long time to compose. The almost aharmonic minor factor made me attempt to use standard chord progressions, but that didn't work. The diatonic chords don't have any 1, 4, 5 chords, and the other chords didn't help since they were just sevenths over the diatonic chords. I tried using variations of A minor to D minor to B flat to F to A minor, but that just felt like aimless wandering in circles. Finally, I came up with a melody that I liked and built the rest of the piece around it. However, I was only able to add 8 to 16 measures a day, even though I spent up to 3 hours working on each of those segments. So this piece taught me that thinking outside of the box is not a trivial undertaking. Eventually, I did piece it together. It starts slow with a slightly ominous tone. It starts to pick up gradually, with the tempo speeding up and slowing down at various points. Meanwhile, it is mostly melodic. Eventually, it becomes a bit more harmonic, As I started feeling more comfortable with the chords I had to work with, I started experimenting with a variety of combinations. I had the most fun with the last two sections. These are centered around the D minor and then the A minor, but the scale influenced some pretty interesting melody lines. Chaos Rules uses the scale pattern minor third, half step, minor third, half step, whole step, half step, half step. This is essentially a minor third and a half step, a minor third and a half step, and a minor third and a half step. However, that would only be 6 notes. So one of the minor thirds is split into a whole step and a half step. The diatonic chords sound minor or dissonant. However, this scale has an abundance of chords. In fact, I am absolutely head over heels in love with this scale. It took me a while to realize just how lavishly adorned with chords it is. But now I am totally smitten. So let's get to know it better. It has a B minor and a B major. It has an E flat minor and an E flat major. It has a G minor and a G major. This is thanks to the minor thirds followed by the half steps. And for that reason, I am calling it the thirds, or les tiers. But wait, there's more! For all of these chords, if you play the major third below the root, the new chord has a major seventh. And that is true for the major and minor chords. But we're still not finished. 3 major thirds create an augmented chord, and because of the half steps, there are 2 of them. And thanks to the 7th note from breaking up the minor third, we get some additional chords. In this case, the A adds a D major, but also the B chords get a natural 7th. And we get 3 notes of an A diminished. So is this not the most amazing scale ever? Chaos Rules starts with the D major, but follows that with a G minor and a B major. And from there, the major, minor, and augmented chords get equal billing. fun with chaos rules than any of the other non-standard scale compositions. Whenever I had an idea, the chords cooperated completely. Every time I tried something, it turned out even better than I had hoped. Chaos Rules is more harmonic than my other non-standard scale compositions, but there are several melodic sections. Of course, when I say melodic, it does not mean a melody as in a song. It is music pared down to single notes with little accompaniment. All of the scale patterns up to this point have been different from standard Western scales, but still close enough to use basic concepts of Western composition. Dancing on the Moon leaves all of that behind. The scale pattern is half step, minor third, half step, half step, major third. That is 3 notes a half step apart from each other, separated by a minor third from 4 notes a half step apart from each other, with a major third to get to the octave. Listen to that again. The diatonic chords are all dissonant. And the only chords outside of that group are D flat and F minor, plus the D flat major 7th and the F minor 6th. So what kind of music can be made with this? Well, first, it is primarily melodic, but even the melodies sound very different from Western music. Dancing on the Moon uses the D flat and F minor as an anchor, but the melody wanders into other territory fairly quickly. But to claim to be Western music, there should be a harmonic element. For this, I use stacked fourths. This is used by jazz musicians quite a bit, but Keith Emerson also used it, which played a significant part in giving Emerson, Lake and Palmer their unique sound. The chords use two natural fourths, or one natural fourth and a sharp fourth. And if you're wondering, it took a while for me to develop muscle memory to hit those notes. So yes, it is possible to create music with non-standard scales that are very different from Western scales. It takes some practice. I have jammed with the recording of Dancing on the Moon and it felt awkward at first. But I came up with a couple of techniques that I might be able to use with standard scales. After composing 6 pieces using non-standard scales, I was working on recording and making videos. But somehow I started fiddling around with chords and melodies, and I got pulled into yet another piece. This one is darker than what I usually do, but I found it to be more and more tantalizing, and I just couldn't stop until it was done. And surprise! The scale pattern is Laitier. So I don't have to go through the details other than to say it is a half step higher than when I used it for Chaos Rules. As I said, it is darker than my usual pieces. It is also the longest piece I have written. To get a sense of how robust Laitier is, listen to part of the section on wildfires. But Laitier allows you to move from ominous to heroic without losing a beat. And from there, you can get to mournful, or pensive, or fearful, or just sad. So, with all due respect, I love this scale! And hopefully, I have given you the motivation and some of the tools you need to go forth and create your own non standard music.